Okay, with no further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome the next panel to the stage, introducing Christina Rain, PE and Senior Project Engineer with Langen, to discuss changing tides, coastal climate adaptability.
Well, thank you for joining us today. I also wanted to introduce the co-panelists. My colleague Haley Farr with Langen, she is a senior project manager and engineer and subject matter expert on brownfield redevelopment and cleanup. Today she is going to be presenting a climate adaptation case study on the Oyster Point landfill. It is a 70-acre office redevelopment, and she will be discussing the climate adaptation measures that were employed there. And in her absence, I also wanted to introduce, thank you, Emily Allen, an associate with field operations. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today due to a family emergency, but she is a landscape architect and urban planner, and she prepared a presentation on the South Bay Sponge project, which is a climate adaptation project that spans an impressive 20 miles along the San Francisco Bay shoreline. And Haley is going to be presenting on her behalf today. And finally, I wanted to introduce Amanda Ludlow. She is a principal at Stantec. She is a subject matter expert on ecological restoration and nature-based solutions and the cleanup of contaminated sites and groundwater. And she is going to be presenting a number of case studies spanning from New York to Florida, going over those nature-based solutions. So our topic statement today is, as sea levels rise and climate policies evolve, coastal brownfields, including former landfills, face urgent challenges that demand innovative, resilient solutions. This session explores how vulnerable shoreline sites in island and coastal communities can adapt to climate impacts while supporting sustainable redevelopment. I'm sorry. So I'm going to be providing an introduction to today's presentation. I'm going to be going over in general what is sea level rise and why it's a concern. I'm going to review how sea level rise and groundwater level rise impact brownfield properties and what the regulatory drivers are for assessing sea level rise issues at brownfields. And then we'll dive into the case studies for solutions and assessment and adaptation. So what is sea level rise? Sea level rise describes rising sea levels in our oceans due to the melting of our ice sheets and glaciers, as well as the expansion of seawater as it warms. Over the past 100 plus years, since about 1880, we've seen 8 to 9 inches of sea level rise on average worldwide. The latest projections from NOAA nationally are from 2022 and predict even with significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, we can still expect to see at least 2 feet of sea level rise by 2100. In the higher projections, and they do have greater uncertainty, but those high projections, we can anticipate about 7 feet of sea level rise on average nationally. In 2024, the state of California also issued its own set of projections, which are similar to these. As sea levels rise, we also expect groundwater levels to rise. And so this is a figure that depicts that phenomenon. We can expect flooding along the shoreline, immediate to the sea, but we can also expect inland flooding or groundwater inundation. And this is a concern in particular for brownfield properties because of the contaminants that are in the subsurface. So contamination that might be present in groundwater can emerge, and you might also have mobilization of contaminants in soil and soil vapor. And that means that at brownfield properties, for both remedies that are in place today and remedies that are being developed for the future, we need to consider these sea level rise issues. So NOAA has wonderful tools available to all communities in the US. I have mapped here the San Francisco Bay Area. It's where I'm from, but I encourage you to use these tools as well. They're available for your communities too. And on the left-hand side of the screen, we can see present-day conditions in the San Francisco Bay. Those green areas depict low-lying areas, and they are susceptible to sea level rise issues and concerns. On the right-hand side of the screen, I've mapped the 2-foot sea level rise scenario. And what you can see from the screen is the blue areas. Those blue areas depict areas that will become flooded at that level of sea level rise. And NOAA also has another tool available that's very helpful, the Flood Exposure Mapper. I've mapped that same scenario here for the 2-foot sea level rise. And on the right-hand side of the screen, again, I've also mapped potential pollution sources or brownfield properties. And those are shown in orange. And just because of the nature of industry, many of those industrial properties are located along our waterways. And here you can see several of those brownfields in the San Francisco Bay Area are in the areas that are vulnerable to flooding due to sea level rise. And many more are located along the margins of those areas where groundwater level rise may be a concern. So what are the regulatory drivers for assessing sea level rise considerations, groundwater level rise considerations in California? Both the DTSC and the Water Board are tasked with inventorying and prioritizing the contaminated lands that are vulnerable to sea level rise and groundwater rise issues. The DTSC in 2023 published their sea level rise for DTSC project managers, and they identified that sea level rise may change hydraulic, geologic, hydrogeologic, and chemical conditions of contaminated sites, and that this may result in the potential increased threat of contaminants, release of contaminants in surface water, groundwater, air, soil, and sediment, and that sea level rise issues need to be mitigated at brownfield properties. Under this guidance, project managers at DTSC are requiring responsible parties to evaluate sea level rise vulnerabilities. And if those vulnerabilities in cleanup remedies are identified, then responsible parties are required to create adaptation plans and implement those adaptation plans as needed. The San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board also recently published an order that amends waste discharge requirements. And this affects 30 bayfront and oceanfront landfills and industrial facilities along the San Francisco Bay. And at those properties, in particular for landfills, the Water Board identified specific vulnerabilities related to potential increase in landfill gas generation, potential increase in leachate production, and mobilization of those concerns. So the potential mobilization of leachate to groundwater resources and the mobilization of landfill gases offsite. And because of how landfills work, they contain waste that degrades over time. The land surface at landfills can actually settle or consolidate so that elevations at these properties will decrease over time. And so that exacerbates the problem. And the Water Board has required these specific facilities that they have identified as vulnerable to prepare long-term flood protection plans. And Haley, in the next case study, is going to present implementation of this order. And finally, I wanted to touch on the Superfund guidance. The US EPA also has discretionary authority to require consideration of climate resilience under the Superfund cleanup program and 5-year review process. They have also issued recommendations that climate resilience be considered under state or non-federal national priorities list sites. And they recommend, in general, conducting climate vulnerability assessments, evaluating resilience measures, and building adaptive capacity, so the ability for remedies to adjust to climate change considerations over time. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Haley.
Hi everyone, I'm Haley Farr, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to present on the Oyster Point Landfill Redevelopment Project in South San Francisco and some of the adaptive remediation strategies that were implemented at this site to address sea level rise. So this first phase of the project was a joint redevelopment with the City of South San Francisco and CALRC Realty. And Langen served as the environmental and geotechnical engineers on the project, and field operations was the landscape architect. Oyster Point is along the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay and was formerly operated as a municipal solid waste landfill by the City of South San Francisco from approximately 1956 through 1970. As Christina mentioned, there are numerous bayfront landfill and other brownfield sites along the margin of the bay that are inherently vulnerable to sea level rise and other impacts. As you may have guessed, Oyster Point was formerly oyster-rich tidal marshlands, hence the name, and some of the inspiration for the landscape design features that we'll touch on later. During the operational history of the landfill, the shoreline was extended over 3,000 feet. And after operations ceased in 1970, the city conducted various closure activities in accordance with the regulatory guidance at the time. Prior to redevelopment in 2016, the site was occupied by several commercial buildings, including a hotel, a harbor master building, and a boat repair facility, as well as parking lots and open space areas. To the north of the site, you can see the South San Francisco Ferry Terminal, as well as the Oyster Point Marina, and the San Francisco Bay Trail also runs around the perimeter of the site. This image is from 2014, and during exceptionally high tides or king tides, the Bay Trail and parking lot areas around the perimeter of the site frequently flooded, which was, the geese and ducks loved it, but obviously not ideal for a bayfront landfill or other site users. Redevelopment of the site is being conducted in several phases, and the first phase of the project involved construction of a commercial life science building on the western portion of the site and open space areas to the east, with the option for additional facilities such as a hotel to be constructed in the future. Due to improvements being within 100 feet of the shoreline, the project required approval from the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, or BCDC. BCDC now has their own 2024 draft regional shoreline adaptation plan with sea level rise guidance included, but at the time the project plans are being developed, they suggested using the medium high risk aversion sea level rise estimates from the 2018 Ocean Protection Council California Sea Level Rise Manual. So that included approximately 2 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and 7 feet by 2100. For this project, the Phase 1C infrastructure portions, the roads, utilities, parking lots, et cetera, those were all designed to 2050 sea level rise with adaptability to 2100, while the Phase 1D building was constructed to the 2100 sea level rise estimates. Phase 2 of the project was recently completed, and phases 3 and 4 that are outside of the landfill footprint but still within BCDC jurisdiction are currently in the planning phases. In response to the waste discharge requirements that were issued by the Water Board, Langen prepared a flood protection plan, long-term flood protection plan in 2023 in conjunction with the project's civil engineer. Although we were primarily looking at flood, we also looked at how groundwater rise could lead to potential increase in leachate production, as well as landfill gas migration. On this figure, blue shows the base flood elevation as of 2023 when the sea level rise assessment was conducted. The magenta shows the anticipated flood extent in 2050, and the red shows the flood extent in 2100. And so these figures incorporated site settlement estimates provided by our geotechnical team and used the sea level rise scenario that I described earlier of 2 feet by 2050 and 7 feet by 2100. And as Christina mentioned earlier, the current anticipated sea level rise trajectory is actually a little bit lower than this, with 1 foot by 2050 and 2 foot by 2100 if we continue to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but most regulatory authorities are still recommending using the medium high risk aversion levels for design. So what this means practically is to address flooding at this site, the settlement needs to be reduced in the red areas in particular, and that in the future, additional fill may need to be placed to mitigate sea level rise impacts. Okay. To address potential rising leachate levels, the team opted to install nested wells within the vicinity of the utility corridors. So we had shallow wells that were screened above the clay cap within the utility corridor, and then co-located deeper wells that were screened within the landfill and leachate below the clay cap. And the shallow wells in the utility corridor were equipped with sensors that alert the city if there's water detected above a certain level. And then there's a response plan in place to further assess if that water is indeed rising leachate levels or if it's potentially just ponded stormwater or other water that on top of the clay cap that just hasn't sheet flowed off yet. At the low points of the utility corridor, sump pumps were also installed in case water needs to be pumped from those areas in the future, and those are connected to the sanitary sewer. And then, although landfill gas conditions may change in the future, since this site is pretty old, like I mentioned, it's not equipped with a landfill gas collection system across the entire landfill, but all of the new structures at the property are equipped with methane mitigation and monitoring systems. And the utility trenches also have trench plugs at certain intervals to mitigate off-site migration of landfill gas. If the perimeter landfill gas wells do see increased methane in the future, we anticipate that the methane mitigation systems for the buildings could be converted to fully active systems to help with the methane capture before it migrates off-site. All right. So this shows the Phase 1D commercial building in the developer portion of the project. And I just wanted to highlight some of the unique design elements that were incorporated to address sea level rise and other considerations specific to developments overlying landfills. You can see some benching and terracing with retaining walls and other features that allowed the building to be at the 2100 sea level rise elevations while the utilities were at lower elevations to tie in to existing grades around the perimeter of the site. Refuse was also relocated from beneath the footprint of the commercial building to the eastern portion of the site, where grades needed to be raised anyways to address sea level rise. Flexible pavers were used around the building that's pile supported to allow for future anticipated settlement. And my favorite part is the inspiration that was incorporated from the geometries of the former oyster beds in the plaza area landscaping. Down along the waterfront, natural and conventional adaptation strategies were incorporated to minimize flood risk while still maintaining access to the shoreline for recreation. The wetlands along the shoreline were maintained or enhanced, and there's also some engineered approaches, like I mentioned, with adding fill to raise the grades. Lightweight cellular concrete was used as fill, underlying the new Bay Trail and the Marina Park and parking lot. And you can see the restroom here. It was a barnacle-inspired shape, and it also had some open ventilation, which allowed us to reduce the methane mitigation system requirements for these buildings. Okay, overall, this project has significantly improved resiliency to sea level rise and revitalized the shoreline habitat, allowing the community to enjoy this beautiful space where technology and nature work together for years to come. Okay, so just wanted to highlight some of the key takeaways from this case study, and just note that these projects are great opportunities to prioritize nature-based solutions, which I'm going to dive into further now. So as Christina mentioned, this is a project that Emily with Field Operations worked on, and I'm just going to be talking about this on behalf of the Field Operations team. So the South Bay Sponge is an innovative model for adapting our urban coastal areas to sea level rise. This framework was developed as part of a design competition in 2016 to 2017 called Resilient by Design. The Field Operations team looked at the intersection of cities and nature and how we can be building with nature rather than in nature. The Resilient by Design competition included 9 interdisciplinary teams, each led by landscape architects with different sites around the Bay Area. The South Bay and Silicon Valley area encompasses some of the lowest lying areas and most vulnerable communities to sea level rise in the Bay Area. But as you all know, Silicon Valley is a hub for innovation, so the area is well poised to address sea level rise challenges and become more resilient. The South Bay Sponge site covered more than 20 miles of shoreline from the Menlo Park area to the north down to Santa Clara. Communities in the South Bay are already experiencing the impacts of flooding today, and conditions are only anticipated to be exacerbated with rising sea levels. So that's where nature-based solutions come in, and thinking of nature as a sponge. Wetlands, marshes, intertidal zones, they already work as a giant sponge, so the idea is to reclaim some of the areas that were historically sponges and restore the important ecological and flood protection benefits in these areas. Practically, this would mean transitioning away from Silicon Valley 1.0, which I know is easier said than done, but this is just, a high-level framework for what could be done. And de-densifying at the bay's edge and establishing new landscapes of absorption while encouraging densification of sites further inland. So this figure illustrates some of the areas that could be converted to freshwater or saltwater sponges, and then some of the salt ponds. There's some ongoing restoration and additional work that could be done along the shoreline to make this more absorptive landscape. And this rendering shows an example of what that could look like with some additional densification further inland, and then the de-densification and access to recreation along the shoreline. And there are tons more beautiful renderings in the Field Operations Resilient by Design report that's available online. So if you're looking for some inspiration, would definitely recommend looking at that. And we're happy to pass along any questions you have specifically about this case study to Emily. You can shout them out in the app or just let us know at the end and we can get back to you. So now I'm going to pass it on to Amanda to talk about some additional case studies highlighting nature-based solutions.
Thank you. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into these nature-based solutions, into the techniques, and maybe give you some ideas on your coastal remedial design projects. So as Christina, in her introduction, had alluded to, that groundwater may be directly influenced by sea level rise, and that's through such things as like the tidal action, your wave action, but also due to the increased storm frequency and intensity, as well as surface water flooding that's coming with climate change. Groundwater rise has been identified as one of the more difficult flood mechanisms to manage, mainly due to its ability to evade and essentially bypass your coastal protections that we pretty much designed specifically for the coastal surges. So as you can see here, rising groundwater due to sea level rise can result in numerous hazards and also impact your remediation challenges, from, let's see, looking at weakening of your slopes. As that groundwater rises, it could result in sloughing of your slopes, as well as daylighting of any LNAPL plumes or contamination, and then also getting involved with your infrastructure, so stormwater sewers and I&I that's essentially becoming a conduit for contaminant migration. So what are nature-based solutions? This is not new, it's just a new terminology. Nature-based solutions, sometimes referred to as engineering with nature. It's a design approach that leverages the positive benefits of natural systems, but also in conjunction with traditional engineering. It's an effective way to minimize and potentially mitigate these groundwater impacts. One of the greatest benefits offered with nature-based solutions is the ability to add multiple layers from the ecosystem services. So that's reducing flooding, local flooding, protecting drinking water, stabilizing stream banks and shorelines, and then also supporting the local economies through the return of clean water, viable habitats, and passive recreational opportunities. So it's this additional layering and all these benefits which increase the long-term health, ecological, and infrastructure resilience to climate change and other environmental impacts. So when we think about these nature-based solutions, just throwing up some specific techniques from green to gray and how we can mix these together. So the biggest advantage that nature-based solutions offers for a coastal environment is the ability to adapt to sea level rise. Because it incorporates living systems, it can naturally adapt to those rising sea levels, as opposed to harder revetments and infrastructure which need to be maintained and redesigned as sea level rises. So it's that, so plant root systems, so going from the greenest. The plant root systems help to improve drainage by removing moisture from the soil, thereby reducing those erosive forces on the slopes. Over time, these plantings create a living mat, which then can further bind the shoreline together. Marshes, looking at marshes associated with wetland restoration, similar to what Haley was just talking to, that these trap sediments from tidal waters, and that allows them to grow with the rising sea level by adapting and growing on top of those additional sediments. So having an entirely vegetated cross-section allows them to grow in elevation as the sea level rises. But many coastal stabilization approaches cannot just be vegetated alone. It's all very site-specific. It depends on the length, it depends on your tidal swing, it depends on your wave action, which all comes from how far of open water you have that fetch that you have to design to. So a lot of the greener solutions have to be combined with your harder. So the softer, greener solutions combined with the hard rock solutions to help protect that investment in the green solution. So mixing your wetlands and your slope stabilization in with a hard rock toe protection, or a sill, or a breakwater, even a detached breakwater, to help reduce those erosive forces from the wave action to ensure that your vegetation can take hold. And so from the hard engineering side of things, looking at protection and erosion control, we can also look at nature-based solutions as a treatment. So as used within a hybrid approach to a conventional treatment. So looking at wetlands, the wetland restoration or wetland preservation can be used to help filter out migration, groundwater migration that could have residual impacts. We use wetlands from an engineered wetland standpoint to treat a variety of different wastewaters, from not just stormwater, but looking at industrial process water, domestic wastewater, high nutrients, mine drainage. So you can adapt those to specifically suit your specific contaminants. We also use a variety of different soils. So looking at compost, say, for metal removal, for looking at reductive dechlorination, permeable reactive barriers, bioreactors. These are all techniques that are nature-based in origin and then can also provide benefits to improving groundwater quality. And then finally, the plants themselves, right? These have, they can have a variety of different root systems. These root systems can go deep depending on what species you're using. Grasslands have a very deep, anywhere from 4 to 6 feet, depending on the soil conditions. These root systems provide a great environment for microbes. In a planted system, you can have 10 times the microbial populations as an unplanted system. So when you think of a revetment versus a vegetated surface, you're going to have a lot more in situ natural degradation occurring. And then these systems also provide stabilization of your contaminants, keeping those contaminants from migrating. So in situ remediation, stabilization, and potentially other phytoremediation solutions. So the first case study I'm going to talk about is White Island. It's located in Brooklyn, New York, around Marine Park, Brooklyn. So this project started in August of 2006, when the New York City Housing and Preservation Department began a 227-acre affordable housing development termed Gateway Estates, just located in South Brooklyn. And it was just about 10 miles or so from this site. As a result of the development, approximately 56 acres of maritime grasslands was going to be permanently altered. DEC, New York State DEC, considered this a significant adverse impact to a specific species, the Henslow sparrow, which led to DEC requiring compensatory mitigation. Typically, we see compensatory mitigation associated with aquatic resources, not for upland resources, but in this case, they required mitigation. So HPD enlisted the support of New York City Parks Department to help with the design and implementation. So the site that was selected is called White Island, and it's an 80-acre former landfill. And this was selected to be the mitigation site because it was larger than the required, than the 56 acres. So we had some buffer to work with. So in the 40s and 50s, the site was used as a sanitary landfill. So a number of years, waste was disposed of, as with much of New York City. A lot of material was disposed in creating these shorelines. And so having exposed waste was a concern and was the first thing that we really needed to address. So unfortunately, over time, excessive erosion of the shoreline resulted in routine sloughing and waste being discharged into the adjacent waterways, into Garrettson Creek. So the first step really in restoring this site, for the goal was, again, it's grassland mitigation. We are designing this island to support specific species, was to stabilize the shoreline. So that's what I'm really going to be focusing on with this case study. So prior to actual implementation, the site was primarily covered with Phragmites, and that's a very aggressive invasive species on the East Coast. Its roots deeply, and it was really loving all of the waste that it was growing in. So very minimal cover and excessive invasive coverage across the whole island. So as you can see, looks like we have some sizing issues. But as you can see from the top photo, this is the Parks Department had done some temporary implementation to control erosion with sandbagging. That's just definitely a temporary solution. It was not a permanent solution. So what we had to do was really redesign this shoreline so that we could keep that waste in place. But several factors determined the selection of the stabilization technique. And that was, one, it was that the inability to cut into the existing surface. We could not expose the presence of waste. That was one of the necessary drivers. The second was the horizontal constraints of the waterfront. And then the erosive forces from the wave action, the big fetch that we had to address. And as you can see, like where the sandbags were in place, those were definitely the steepest and the most exposed to wave action. And then looking at the biggest one is longevity, right? That the island does not provide public access and will not be maintained. So therefore, any chosen solution, shoreline treatment, would need to be self-sustaining. So vegetation was recognized as an effective, sustainable, and attractive form for the slope stabilization, but due to it, based upon its, the slopes, it wasn't necessarily going to be the only solution. So we really had to balance our soft with our hard. So while the majority of the island was encircled with these steep eroding slopes, we did have a couple patches that were greater than a 4-to-1 slope. So we had some gradual slopes. So our focus was really to preserve those areas, not alter those areas, and make sure that we use that that vegetation, maybe enhance those with some additional species, but really not to disturb those. Those root systems are set, they're stabilized. Those 4-to-1s or shallower slopes are fine. We're not going to alter those. So we really focused on the steeper slopes. As preference was given to bioengineering solutions that we somehow incorporate vegetation, but there were a couple areas that we had to use heavier, harder stone, and that's like armor stone. We had like 2,000-pound rocks. And so those systems were in the steepest slopes, so less than a 2-to-1, so 1.5-to-1. Those areas were armored with large armor stones. And then in the slopes between 2-to-1 and 3-to-1, we used different bioengineering products. So in the 2-to-1, we used the articulated concrete block, which is an open-celled concrete that's essentially installed with a boom and laid in blankets. And then the cellular confinement is a geoweb that can be stretched out. Both of those can be backfilled with your soil and vegetated. So looking at underneath your surface, you have this lateral support system, and then the plants can grow down through that system. And so when you see, after everything's been being stabilized with your vegetation, you don't even see that underlying material, which is really nice. So it's a nice green cap on top of your structures. But over time, as I was mentioning with vegetation, those root systems become an additional support mechanism for your shoreline stabilization. As you look on the bottom, that's what the shoreline looks like today. So the true test was Hurricane Sandy. So we had just finished the shoreline in October of 2012 and had brought in all material for the top of the island. So the restoration of the island included bringing in about 150,000 cubic yards of dredged sand working with the Army Corps of Engineers from the Rockaway Inlet. So in order to keep invasive species from reemerging on the island, we had to bring in at least 3 feet of sand to keep the Phragmites from resprouting. So 150,000 yards of sand, seeding of that island, and we had the shoreline complete, and then Hurricane Sandy hit. And so this is the true test of our system, right? And so when you look at where Sandy had the storm surge, it was anywhere from 11 to 15 feet up the edge of the island. We had no erosion, so no breakage, completely intact, which is really a big success story of what vegetation and what bioengineering solutions can do. So the second project is just further west of White Island in Staten Island, New York. They did not survive so well during Sandy. So the south shore of Staten Island is really exposed. And over years, it's sustained decades of coastal erosion. Its condition made worse by Superstorm Sandy and left the communities vulnerable to future storms. So as part of New York Rising's community reconstruction plans, the state of New York set up the Tottenville Shoreline Protection Project, a storm recovery and resilience initiative. The TSPP had 3 main goals: reduce coastal risks, including erosion and the impact of storm waves, enhance the shoreline and near shore habitats to provide additional protection, foster social resilience to extreme weather events through education, stewardship, safe public water access. So the initial concept for this solution was a stone core sand-capped dunes, so a complete barrier along this whole shoreline. And that was would be designed to attenuate wave energy, prevent the erosion, prevent intrusion of sea level rise into the interior neighborhoods. However, our modeling showed that the natural sediment supply, the resupply in this area would not be able to be sufficient to replenish that dune sand over the long term. And in addition, many of the areas slated for this were not wide enough to support the installation of this berm. So to address these challenges, we developed a number of different solutions for each specific area. So it's looking at, we can break these down. We have the earthen berm, various revetments, and a raised edge. And these I want to also mention that this design was done in tandem to the Living Breakwater project, which was the winner of the Rebuild by Design competition in New York and actually just finished construction. So there is some protection occurring now with those breakwaters that are detached from the shoreline and further out into the bay. So yeah, the design approach uses that layered system with wetland enhancement, eco-revetments, berms, and the first one I want to talk about is the earthen berm. So this is a raised, wide berm weaving through the existing shoreline, through existing forest areas, and this is all designed to protect the inland communities. So it's topped with soil, and so it is an earthen berm, so it's just soil, but it's topped with soil suitable for replanting and restoration, and also to create a network of public access through these regions. Moving into more of the hardened side of things, the eco-revetment. So in the upper left, you can see this is the wetland eco-revetment. So this is a sheet pile wall system that was constructed through the existing wetland to be restored, and then the wetland would be restored and enhanced to provide additional protection. And then on the back side, it's a hardened wall for that protection. So this was selected because it's the minimal footprint to reduce the impact into those wetland areas, but also support significant protection for the communities. The upper right is the Surf Avenue, and that is a stone revetment with plantings and public access elements, again, get downs to the beach. And so this is the most public segment, so it's the most hardened shoreline. It's the most robust, includes a thick layer of soil in the root mass and a large stone core. So I don't think we can see it in this, but it's a stone core, not just a berm, but it's a stone core, and so then that was revegetated. Also, a comprehensive stormwater study enabled the team to integrate green infrastructure practices, you can see in the lower left, in the overall design, including the use of bioswales, where we can fit them in, and studied the reuse of buyout lots near the project area. The hybrid dune revetment, as you can see, has that that core, that stabilized core, so the rock core to help really build. So instead of an earthen berm, which would need a bigger area, we have this hardened stone core. And so that's a sand dune on the surface. So it looks like a sand dune with beach grasses, but it's hardened underneath, providing additional engineering support. This was located where sufficient beach space already existed, and it sits inland to minimize any risk of erosion, so not directly exposed. And then the raised edge. So this section of the shore is not subject to moderate wave action. So it's an inland community and already at a higher elevation, and designed to minimize any earthwork, any of that regrading, and continues the path alignment along the shore, improves the water quality, and by introducing drainage swale, so bioswale behind that bank solution. So the project was in the final design stages and about to enter procurement, but is currently paused due to the suspension of FEMA BRIC funding. So we will cross our fingers for the future for that. And then the last project I want to talk about is the stormwater park, Connor Park in Palmetto, Florida. So this is about taking a vision from the beginning and taking that into account with your brownfield remediation. So this is not necessarily looking at our shoreline, but looking at how the asset transformation post-brownfield. So this is a site situated right along the Manatee River in Palmetto, Florida. It's formerly contained a contaminated rail yard and spur. The land was really focused on remediating. It's mainly shallow contamination in the top 4 to 5 feet. And so historically, we did operate as a rail spur. Then the city purchased the site, and then the Community Redevelopment Agency took over the work and started the investigations. So arsenic was the primary contaminant with the various petroleum, looking at hydrocarbons, as well as elevated nitrogen. Multiple grants were awarded to support the various phases of the investigation, but then also for the park transformation. So the vision. So this site is situated in the southern edge of Palmetto, city of Palmetto, right, as you can see, the Manatee River is right down here with the Palmetto Bay. So Palmetto Bay there's restoration plans to improve the habitat of that bay. So looking at installing reef balls, oyster habitat, seagrass restoration. So with the long-term vision of protecting that investment, looked at how can we transform this park to help improve those conditions. And that's through looking at treat this as a stormwater park. There is roughly a 50-acre drainage, a watershed that comes down to that park. Historically, before remediation, a lot of contaminants migrated their way into the river from that site. So yes, the brownfields, the asset transformation was to let's manage that, let's get hotspot control. But what can we do in the future? Not just make it a clean site, but can we provide benefits ongoing into the future? And that's through the transformation of providing stormwater treatment on this site. So prior to remediation, this is the parcel right here, a couple acres, pretty small parcel. And then as we move through the remediation, hotspot control, then starting to construct this into a stormwater basin. And this basin stores about 500,000 gallons. So from that 50-acre drainage area, you have a really great opportunity to detain, slow down that stormwater, and provide treatment before it discharges. And that's where you see those numbers, the previous slide with the nitrogen and the phosphorus removal. So then in the rendering, and today. And with additional park features for public access, very passive, there's a surrounding trail, different educational signage, and just really offers a nice passive solution for community redevelopment. And in summary, MBS has demonstrated success in urban and high energy environments. This is not new. Nature-based solutions have been around a long time. where there's just a new terminology and a new focus on really what all those benefits, all those co-benefits that they offer, all the layers that you can add in to improve that asset transformation. So it doesn't necessarily only address environmental challenges, but also the social and the economic, always thinking about that end use of the property. And thank you.
Awesome. We now have 10 minutes for question and answer. Please raise your hand if you have any questions for our talented panelists. Anyone, please? What have been some unsuspected benefits in biodiversity or elsewise that you've seen when implementing one of these coastline changes?
So, is this good? Can you hear me? Okay. So unexpected would probably be the additional habitat, some species that you're not necessarily designing for that start inhabiting those because you make it, you build it, they will come. That really does happen. Even with just flooded ponds, you see that on Haley's site. So those systems, they're all attractive to wildlife. But it's also, White Island was not designed for public access. Yet people kayak and canoe and migrate their way there just to experience that quiet peacefulness in a very busy city. So it wasn't designed for public access, but it does provide that benefit and appreciation as well.
Hi, I'm Sarah Belafonte. I'm with the city of Pittsburgh, California. Really interesting mix of nature-based solutions given, and being in California, I've specifically had some issues with getting permits for stabilizing some of our steeper shorelines. So the example you gave was obviously a mitigation project, a required mitigation project, and this is more like around a municipal marina. But two things kind of struck me from your presentation. The first being the horizontal geolayer that you placed. We've gotten a lot of feedback that's basically said if it's a geolayer that has any kind of plastic elements to it, so if it's a polymer, you can't place it. It will eventually end up in the water. So was your geolayer plastic? Are there other solutions out there that you use that are effective? And the other is we've had a lot of issues and a lot of pushback with placing riprap and rock, even just replacing riprap and rock. And we've essentially been told in certain areas of our shoreline, those kinds of projects will not be approved. So kind of, especially for steeper slopes, seawalls and things like that we've generally gone with are seeming to come out of favor. Do you have kind of the next gen of what our solutions are going to be?
So the cellular confinement was geo. So it's buried, it's underlying, so it's less susceptible to UV degradation. And then if it does degrade, we still have given the plants time to take hold, to establish that shoreline. And we also have toe protection for the steeper slopes, all of the articulated concrete block, the cellular confinement, all had toe protection to just hold it up, and then they're anchored in the top. So over time, the vegetation should be the long-term solution. One of the things I've seen elsewhere is that the regulatory process is much more amenable to rock, that you're going to harden your shoreline. You get a much faster review process, much faster approval. Nature-based solutions, less so. So there is still this learning curve that's associated with approval of those projects and coming up with more hybrid alternative techniques. Last year I was down at the Engineering with Nature Symposium, and Army Corps was specifically addressed, that's one of their things, is that it's very hard to get these solutions implemented. It may take a year, and it's because of they may be proven, but not everybody has implemented them. So it's that learning curve that, and hopefully over time, this will become second nature, and there'll be a preferred approach to using nature-based as opposed to hardening with rock.
it's on now. All right, so specifically in the Bay Area, I can follow up with Emily, but their team was doing more of the coordination with regulatory agencies for the shoreline improvements at Oyster Point specifically, and I know they've worked on other sites around the Bay Area, but we had similar issues with pushback from agencies, and yeah, we had to replace some riprap pushback. So I think it's a universal issue. So I think if we just keep framing it and pushing for it, then hopefully it'll become more accepted.
Yeah, so I'm based out of the Bay Area. Oyster Point is a great example of this kind of question. And so basically my question is, with the rising of sea levels, is it feasible that we would be looking at a more challenging scenario for indoor air VOC penetration and LNAPL rising with the groundwater?
Short answer, yes. But as you know, all these buildings have mitigation systems anyways, so they're handled to equip those changes in the future. The Oyster Point specifically, you know, methane was the main contaminant of concern, but there were some VOCs also, so we have to do ongoing monitoring for the air district. So we're looking at all of that in the long term as part of our management.
Excellent. Do we have any more questions from the crowd? Oh, great. With the last 5 minutes then, seeing none, maybe we can just go through, and if you have any closing thoughts or any takeaways that you want to leave this audience with. Yeah, who's ever ready to go first?
Only that this is an important issue that we do need to consider and plan for, and being proactive in the cleanup remedies that we are proposing to make sure that we're considering the long-term stability and protectiveness for our work and the buildings and communities that we're designing for. And certainly, I think the solutions are there, so it's perhaps just a learning curve for us as professionals to implement these in our everyday work.
And I would say from a Bay Area perspective, I think everyone has seen the impacts like I showed in some of our pictures, and so just education, because some people across the country might not have as big of issues with sea level rise if they're more inland. So yeah, just communication and education across the country.
And I guess my final thought is that nature-based solutions doesn't have to be the only solution, right? It's just like with when you look at bioengineering, it's blending your hard and your soft, recognizing the values that each of those provides. You can blend nature-based solutions in with a conventional remediation process, so that, you know, looking at combining the two, getting the most value at the end for the asset transformation for that community, or what the end use is going to be.
Thank you. Can we get another round of applause for our panelists today? Thank you all so much. If you have any other follow-up questions, I encourage you to use the Hoover app, or please reach out. They're all really passionate about this topic, and we just really appreciate their time. Thank you. I am pleased to announce now that we've hit halfway mark of the conference, so if you're able to do the CALRC evaluation survey, we would really appreciate that with the QR code at your tables. Lunch will now be served with the upcoming plenary Women Visionaries taking place in 1 hour in Hall BC. Thank you all.